I don't make the same mistake once or twice. I tend to do it multiple times and I get really good at it.
It takes a certain strength of character to say sorry. So in 2023, we're not apologizing for things we didn't do.
When did you ever do that?
Never. Females tend to apologize more than men.
Shocking, eh? The brain already knows we are making the mistake within a fraction of a second before we are even aware of it.
Germany lost the First World War because they believed the rumor. I really hope that our listeners feel better about their mistakes now.
I am Ana, and together with my co-host Andrea, in this episode we'll be discussing mistakes and the regret of living with the mistakes we haven't made.
Welcome to Sonder Characters. By definition, a mistake is an act or judgment that is misguided or wrong, or something that is not correct. A wrong action, statement, or judgment. I didn't say that, Google says that.
The way I see it, and here I like to quote William Shakespeare, he says, "There is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so."
What is your view on mistakes and regrets?
Well, Andre, I think I must really adore both making mistakes and having regrets. Otherwise, I don't know how I'm going to justify the pile I gathered over the years. To be honest, I don't think I regret my mistakes. But the ones I do is probably because I didn't listen to myself. I knew deep in my heart that I should not be doing that, but I went against that. And I think that's why I remember them. Also, I noticed from experience, of course, I don't make the same mistake once or twice. I tend to do it multiple times and I get really good at it. I make mistakes every day, but I don't like to live with regrets. And I think my biggest regret is not expressing myself or my feelings when I was supposed to. I think that's my biggest regret.
That's a toughie.
And also because I know there are long-term consequences. Nowadays, I try my best to say everything I feel like it's worth saying. If I have something on my heart, oh, you're going to hear from me. I don't want to be thinking about it for the next 4 years. So I no longer leave things unsaid. What about you, Andre?
In my head, I have a very clear distinction between what I call a regret and a mistake. And I think everything I feel that's a regret, it all boils down to one common denominator and is very similar to what you said. Because it's not so much about what I did or I didn't do, but whether I felt like I abandoned myself by doing or not doing something. You know, mistakes or things that I have done that I class as mistakes are what I call maybe a lapse of judgment or not paying enough attention to something. Like, you know, that time I kicked a boiling kettle on my foot and gave myself a second-degree burn because, yeah. Or what I would call a mistake in my books is that time when I passed the virus to my pregnant friend because she wanted a sip of my iced coffee and I was ill. And then she temporarily forgot she's pregnant. So we were both sick. Thank God nothing happened. But yeah, that was a lapse of judgment. Regrets, for me, they come from the fact that I know deep in my heart that I didn't act in my best interest, regardless of what that was. And I listen to this. You won't regret the things you did. You'll regret the things you didn't do when you had the chance. Why? Why do you think that is?
Andre, I've been carrying this question with me for such a long time. Because if you are someone in their 60s, 70s, okay, one thing that you regret is always the things they haven't done, things that they should have done. What if I should have? I'm intrigued to my very core. So, of course, I did some research and I came across an article from Quartz, and this is called "A New Study on the Psychology of Persistent Regrets Can Teach You How to Live Now." In this article, they talk specifically about a new paper by David A. and Gilovich. In their latest study, they build up on the existing research about the types of regret that have incredible staying power, the ones that stay with us, namely those about what we could have done, not the one we did do wrong. So even though we experience both sorts, these studies have found that across cultures and demographics, is regrets about inaction that haunt most of us for long periods. And we already know that. We already agree with that. Even psychologists have tried to understand why this asymmetry exists. Now, what I love about this paper is that the authors noted that action-related regrets spur reparative work, and this will allow us to deal with them and let them go. They gave a few examples. So, for instance, if we missed our daughter's graduation, we can always apologize. and arrange an alternative celebration. Or if we move to another city for work and regret leaving behind, for instance, our extended family, we can always fly back home and spend more time with them over particular holidays, or we can always go back, move back if we want to. But they say there's usually little to be done about the goals or the plans, the actions that we didn't act on to begin with. The examples they give here is the one who got away. Maybe now she or he is married to someone else. There's very little we can do. Or a once in a lifetime job opportunity. Those are the ones that stay with us. And they say that we also process these two types of regrets differently. Of course, they have a very large paper on this. The article goes extensively into detail. So we're going to put the link on sondercharacters.com. But based on what I've read, it comes down to hot and cold emotions. And that's why they are so different. A hot emotion, the response might be anger or guilt. But with cold emotions, we believe we can jump into our pockets and deal with later.
How interesting. I've never really heard emotions being referred to in that way.
So, for instance, they were talking about selling your house at the wrong time. That will become a lesson learned, or ultimately reveals a silver lining. But when you miss someone's birthday, one of the authors suggests that you might spend some time questioning your motives and your relationship with that individual because you feel guilty about having messed up. So it's hard to leave that kind of problem unsolved because it's a hot emotion that is going through our brains. But we don't feel the same pressure to process regrets from the path not taken. And that's largely because the absence of action doesn't bring out this hot emotion response in us, the anger, the embarrassment, the guilt. A psychology professor from Columbia University took this research further. He explains that failing to take action in the long term, that initial reaction that seemed relatively small to begin with actually grows and becomes bigger and bigger because it's a cold emotion. It doesn't burn us from inside in the same way that guilt and shame does. But in 20 years or 20 years of this cold emotion can become really painful.
So, long story short, in the short term, avoiding to make that mistake or to take a particular action will seem like no big deal. But long term, it will turn into a regret.
Exactly. So I say, kids, live with memories, not regrets. One thing about hot emotions is that sometimes a simple apology or a simple sorry can make a world of a difference.
Mm.
Now, and they're coming from Eastern Europe. How easy do you think it was for us to say sorry?
I'm just going to say that one of the biggest culture shocks I had when I moved to the UK was how polite people were in general. And I think this is a known fact about the British, right? Like there's a lot of jokes around it. But the ease with which people say thank you, please, and sorry. And short part of that is education. But in the Eastern European culture, or the way I experienced Eastern European culture, we tend to use language in a more direct way. So when I moved here initially, my thought process was in Romanian. I wasn't thinking in English. And I think I came across as more direct because that's how we speak back home. And we don't tend to say please, sorry, and thank you that much. Of course, we are polite, but it's just the way we use language. I recall my first years here, and I didn't think I was rude, but I think I came across as rude or direct. And I think sometimes I'm still fighting with that. But in my mind, it was just the normal way of thinking. I don't know about you, but I really had to educate myself on how not to come across like that. And whilst I was fine with the please and thank yous, like the sorry was the one that used to get to me all the time because I didn't really understand why people apologize for everything.
I think back home, you would say words not as frequent because they mean something. But then I fell in the other extreme in the sense that at work I would say sorry for everything just because I thought, oh, actually, I need to apologize. But sometimes it didn't mean anything because I knew I wasn't wrong.
So you might be familiar with what I'm going to share next. I don't think I realized that saying sorry too much is coined as a sorry syndrome in psychology. And the conclusion of the syndrome isn't great because some of the research that I looked into says, and here I quote, where the sorries are high, the self esteem is low. I started to look into where the sorry syndrome starts and where does it come from and why do we suffer from it. So, going back to how we start saying sorry, some of us are taught as children to say sorry when we don't meet an adult expectation, right? And that's different from family to family, from culture to culture. But I think the danger is that the unconscious message that we get is that saying sorry equals putting an end to an uncomfortable or confrontational conversation or situation. So there are a couple of reasons for which why, as adults, we may say sorry too much. I'm going to list some. Insecurity, wanting to fit in, anxiety. So, for example, worrying about being wrong or upsetting someone, and I'm calling all the people pleasers here.
Yeah.
And then there's culture. For example, research suggests that the British are more likely to say sorry compared to Americans. I mean, I looked into the whole research because I was just fascinated by it. But let me just give you a glimpse into it. A third of the British people would apologize for a sneeze compared to just 22% of the Americans. Similarly, 36% in Britain would say sorry if someone bumped into them versus 24% in America. And while all but 19% of Americans would feel comfortable correcting someone who is in the wrong, 27% of British people would feel the need to ask for forgiveness. And then I started looking into what's the most apologetic country in the world. And Japan is the most apologetic country in the world, shortly followed by Canada and then the UK.
Mind blowing.
Yeah. The other aspect that influences how much we say sorry is our gender. Females tend to apologize more than men. So the idea of saying sorry too much can really, really work against us in a social context. And I'll tell you why. It's because we can be perceived as submissive, easy to manipulate. And not only that, but it's also like a bit of a self-sabotage thing. We put a lot of pressure on ourselves. And then I was thinking about all the times I said sorry, or I didn't want to say sorry, but I felt like I had to say sorry. And sometimes I say sorry when I'm uncomfortable in a certain situation. And here I'm thinking gym situations. Not that I have been to one in ages, but if I took too long to put the kettlebell down, I would just be like, sorry, sorry. But why?
Yeah.
Reading all of this, thinking, okay, but what can you do? And instead, I made a list of things that we shouldn't apologize for.
Fire away, Andre.
So in 2023, we're not apologizing for things we didn't do. For example, apologizing for someone else's behavior. Anna, next time when you get drunk, I'm not apologizing for you. It's on you.
When did you ever do that?
Never, but it's a hypothetical
No, no.
situation. In 2023, we are not apologizing for small things, not to be confused with being polite. My example from the gym was perfect. If it's gonna take you 15 seconds to put the weights back on in the gym, you're not gonna apologize for that. Then the next thing on my list is saying sorry to avoid conflict. We are not going to say sorry to avoid a conflict. We are all grown here. We can deal with a little bit of conflict. We are not going to say sorry to diffuse a situation. We can do it.
Oh, I totally agree.
And for 2023, we are also not saying sorry for making reasonable requests. For example, asking for a friend who is coming over to bring me a snack. I'm not going to apologize for asking that anymore. I just won't do it. And the last but not least, we are not apologizing for no reason. Oh, and I'm sorry, so sorry that the weather is bad. Honey, I'm not controlling the weather.
Oh, okay, I'm not gonna apologize for the weather no more.
In 2023, you are going to stop doing that. To be honest, I was thinking about that, and I actually have a little tip that I have learned on a leadership course. Instead of saying sorry, try saying thank you. So instead of saying sorry, I ask you to get me a snack, you can try saying thank you for bringing me a snack and making a stop along the way. Instead of saying sorry, I made you wait, you can say thank you for being so patient and waiting for me, even though I was 5 minutes late. On the opposite of saying sorry is not being able to apologize at all. And I luckily don't have that many people in my life. I don't keep them in my life if they can do that. What was really interesting when I looked at it is that over apologizing and not apologizing, they have one thing in common. They both come from a low self esteem, except that not apologizing is a sign of a high ego, too. Psychologically speaking, admitting that we're wrong is emotionally uncomfortable and painful to our sense of self. In order to take responsibility and apologize, our self esteem needs to be healthy and it needs to be strong enough for us to absorb that discomfort. But if our self esteem is higher and stable, we can tolerate the temporary discomfort that an admission of guilt involves without the walls around our ego crumbling. I didn't say that. I was looking into the psychologist called Guy Winch, and he has an amazing TED talk on it. And he says that the people who cannot apologize often have such deep feelings of low self worth that their fragile egos cannot absorb the blow of admitting they were wrong. And I think we all knew this to a certain extent, Why is it so hard to say sorry? Well, it's not for some people, isn't it? Because I just said that some people actually over apologize. So these people who cannot say sorry, their defense mechanism kicks in, and at times it's unconscious. But they may externalize and blame and even dispute basic facts to ward off the threat of having to lower themselves by offering an apology. The thing is that when they double down on their wrongness by blaming circumstances or denying the facts or attacking the other person, non-apologizer can make themselves feel empowered. Unfortunately, for a lot of us, we see this behavior of defensiveness as a sign of psychological strength. And that is because outwardly they appear to be tough individuals who refuse to back down. But they don't do this because they're strong. They do it because they're weak.
Yeah, I think there is so much strength in being vulnerable and admitting you were wrong. I mean, I'm not saying to do that every 5 seconds, but in some circumstances.
I think the thing is, we all know when we are wrong. If we have the courage to take a look at who we are as people, we know when we are wrong. And then the next step is admitting guilt of that. It takes a certain strength of character to say sorry. So, this psychology says that as a rule of psychological thumb, what we have to understand is that the more rigid one's defense mechanism are, the more fragile the ego that they're protecting. That's a really interesting perspective. I mean, there's a full article on it, and it also gives advice on how to deal with someone who doesn't apologize. Because, quite frankly, if someone doesn't want to apologize for something that they've done wrong, you have to almost like invent that closure. And then you have to accept and articulate what's going to happen with that person going forward. And that's really hard. I can accept if someone is wrong and I can accept an apology. But if someone does me wrong and they cannot apologize, I have to rethink the whole reason for why these people are in my life. What's the balance? What's the win? What's at stake here, really?
I just think for a person that over apologizes to be in a friendship relationship with a person that does not apologize, I see how that might look like manipulation. Okay, Andre, Winston Churchill once said, all men make mistakes, but only wise men learn from their mistakes.
I could not agree more.
I found this article on why mistakes are important because I think we need to understand, do we need to make mistakes? I do them because I enjoy doing them. But how is that so important? How is that going to help us long term? I found a study on how the brain detects and deals with errors and mistakes. Researchers have used caps equipped with sensors that can measure brain activity.
Interesting.
So, one thing researchers have found using this method is that the brain creates a specific kind of brain activity when a person makes a mistake. Just for a bit of context, I never thought I would enjoy saying this, but the brain cells communicate with each other using electricity. Shocking, eh? Some of this electrical activity travels away from the brain cells to the outside of the head, and it passes through brain tissues, the skull, and your skin along the way. In the laboratory, researchers studied this brain activity related to errors by giving someone a very difficult task. So they did this kind of research in the house. And these people, he or she, was bound to make a mistake. Now, when the person makes an error, apparently a specific pattern of brain activity shows up. And this is described as a sharp electrical activity that is the strongest at the top of the head. Since this is negatively charged and associated with making errors, they called it error-related negativity. Okay?
All clear.
They say that this activity happens at the same time that the error is made. In other words, the brain already knows we are making the mistake within a fraction of a second before we are even aware of it.
Wow.
I know. So many scientific studies have found that the stronger this error-related negativity, the slower the response in the next round tends to be.
That explains why it takes me buying a plane ticket so long.
You've been burned before?
Do you not remember that time when I had to change our flights 5 times?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So some people have a larger error-related negativity than others. And the question they were trying to answer is, does this mean that these people are more sensitive to making errors and learning from their mistakes? And most of the studies seem to support that idea. In one of the papers on error-related negativity, which predicts academic performance, These authors found that a stronger error-related negativity was actually associated with better school performance. In this study, the researchers measured the brain activity of university students and found that students who had a larger ERN also tended to have better grades.
Well, straight A student here, ex-straight A student here talking. It would be interesting to find out what my ERN is.
You know what? Based on the first part of the research, you would think, actually, I would like to have a larger error-related negativity so, I can perform better. But what's useful to know is that having a strong ERN, it's actually not necessarily always a good thing, because people who are more anxious actually tend to have stronger error-related negativity.
Mm.
And very strong brain responses to errors are also associated with increased distractibility rather than improved focus.
Yeah.
I think this is the definition of being an overthinker.
In scientific words, yes.
If a normal error-related negativity shows the brain reacting and responding to errors, then a really strong error-related negativity might be the brain overthinking and also being more upset and alarmed by making a mistake. We know making mistakes, it's annoying, it's frustrating. We don't want to look foolish. Sometimes we want to avoid them. However, it seems to be very important for us to learn from our mistakes so we can correct our responses and do things differently the next time we are in the same situation. And as we noted earlier, larger error-related negativity following errors was significantly correlated with better academic performance. But they also say that seems to be associated with improved real-world performance. The better you get at responding to these mistakes, the better you will perform in the real world.
I just wonder what real-world performance means in this context.
Probably making a little mistake at work.
It makes me think about one of the questions that I really like to ask in interviews to candidates is, give me an example of an error and what have you done to solve it? For me, it's really interesting to see how people perceive their sense of self and a degree of accountability as well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Anna, we all make mistakes and we all have regrets. But on this podcast, we like to give you the gift of perspective. So, Anna, let's tell our audience what were the biggest mistakes in the history. And if you're listening to us, we'll tell you that you did not get it as bad as these guys.
I know. So when I was looking for mistakes in general, I mean, a mistake might be swimming with your dog that has panic attacks and is trying to drown you. But when we are looking at the real world, the history, seems like every country is making mistakes, some bigger, some smaller. So the first one is France. In 2014, Andre, France suffered international embarrassment and lost millions of dollars. Why? Because they bought trains too wide for the platforms.
Oh, wow.
They purchased 2,000 brand new trains for 15 billion euros. And unfortunately, nobody double checked the measurements. And the new trains were too wide for the platforms and trucks. I mean, it's not a couple of pounds kind of mistake. It's a 15 billion euros tiny mistake. I wonder what they are doing with 2,000 trains.
I wonder what's the learning curve from here. Who failed? Who got fired? Can I tell you my favorite one?
Okay.
I have a few favorites, but this one is just so epic. Germany lost the First World War because they believed a rumor. The First World War is a critical turning point in history because it led to the creation of the League of Nations, the Russian revolutions, and the fall of the German Empire. But it turns out that the Germans suffered defeat in part because they believed a rumor. At one point, the British soldiers spread a rumor that Russian Cossacks were on their way to the Western Front. Everyone fell for this fake story, including the media. And Germany made a tactical mistake when they believed the story and completely changed their military plans. The decision to change their plans led to Germany losing the war. Incredibly, the Russian Cossacks didn't even exist.
Oh.
So Germany's worst mistake is often called the Russian rumor.
Don't believe rumors, I guess. Is this the lesson to be learned here? Now, if I light up the mood a bit and come to our England, walkie-talkie. This is one of the biggest mistakes in architecture history. Apparently, the stunning building finished construction in 2014. Wonderful. But it wasn't a smooth process because during the construction, they discovered a strange problem. So when the sun would shine directly on the building, it will act as a mirror and shine the light onto the streets. Now, the heat from the sunbeam was so intense, it damaged cars and set a few doormats on fire.
Oh my God.
It got so hot that this reporter, Jim Watterson, was able to fry an egg on the street.
Wow.
Mic drop.
Well, in light of the current cost of living crisis, I would suggest that we might go back to that. Don't park on the street, but maybe fry your egg there.
I know, right?
I have another one from the 1300s. This is about Italy. So some fellows from Modena stole a bucket from Bologna, and that resulted in a great deal of humiliation for the Bolognese. They declared war, had a battle, had around 2,000 casualties, split between both sides, and failed to reclaim the bucket.
Okay. So Modena ended up staying with the bucket and a few dead bodies.
Yeah.
Let's go to US for a second. So in the entire state of Ohio in 1895, there were only 2 cars on the road, only 2 on the. That was all they had. And the drivers of these 2 cars crashed into each other. The chances of an accident is 100%.
I really hope that our listeners feel better about their mistakes now.
I know. No one started a war
over a bucket.
over a bucket. Well, I think we're doing just fine, Andrea.
Perfect.
Andrea, if you had to describe mistakes in one phrase, what would you say?
Ana, if I am going to live through this life authentically, as the most Andrea I can be, I want my mistakes to have my handwriting on it. That's it.
That's deep. Do them your way.
Exactly.
And I would say that I live with memories, not regrets. So to many more mistakes, I say. Cheers to that, Andrea.